Hey guys, have you heard of Goldbelly? It's this amazing site where they ship the most iconic, famous foods from restaurants across the country, anywhere, nationwide. I've never found a more perfect gift than food. They ship Chicago deep dish pizza, New York bagels, Maine lobster rolls, and even Ina Garten's famous cakes. So if you're looking for a gift for the food lover in your life, head to goldbelly.com and get 20% off your first order with promo code GIFT.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Fiscally responsible, financial geniuses, monetary magicians. These are things people say about drivers who switch their car insurance to Progressive and save hundreds. Visit progressive.com to see if you could save. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Potential savings will vary, not available in all states or situations.
Hello, this is Simon Brew. I'm the editor of Film Stories magazine, and a very warm welcome to the Film Stories podcast. I'm broadcasting here from my secret underground bunker that nobody could possibly... Oh, hello. How did you get here?
I rerouted your IP address. Finding you was way too easy.
Uh-oh.
Come with me.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
And movies that had stories.
That the story just sucks them in.
This is just the beginning.
Stories. We would be honored if you would join us.
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Film Stories with Simon Brew. I am Simon Brew. As always, there's absolutely everything you need to know about me. The aim of the podcast, though, is given away by its title. I'm here to talk of the stories of films, and I tend to talk about development stories, production stories, marketing stories, release stories, all those ingredients, really, that go towards making the films that we know and sometimes love. Just that, the films that we know and sometimes love. The films I tend to cover on this podcast, they lean more towards the mainstream than anything else. They're films I'm interested in or invested in to some degree. I try really hard not to do snark. I try really hard not to punch down. This podcast is a celebration of cinema and a real appreciation that somehow, films manage to get made. In each episode of Film Stories, each regular episode, I cover the tales of two different movies, and I'm going to do the same again. Shall we get on with it then? I'm going to play you a clip from the trailer of the first of the two films I'm talking about, and then we'll come to its story, The Other Side of This.
How come nobody's ever tried to be a superhero?
Well, I don't know. Probably because it's impossible.
Putting on a mask and helping people? How's that impossible?
Dude, if anybody did it in real life, they get their ass kicked.
Oh, no, I'm just standing around, you know.
No, not... Ah! I was just a regular guy.
Hey, gorgeous.
Hey, my only superpower was being invisible to girls. But the comic books had it wrong. You don't need a power to be a superhero.
Leave him alone! It's none of your business!
Yes, it is.
Hey, there's a dude just like a superhero. They're fighting a bunch of guys. Who are you? I'm Kick-Ass.
Kick-Ass has become the latest internet phenomenon.
This is awesome.
He was actually pretty good.
He should call himself Ass Kick instead.
He's inspired a wave of real-life superheroes.
Tool up, honey bunny. It's time to get bad guys.
You wanna go fight some crime?
Good idea, why not? That is a clip from 2010's Kick-Ass, directed by Matthew Vaughn. Screenplay by Jane Goldman and Matthew Vaughn, based on Kick-Ass by Mark Miller and John Romita Jr., and starring Aaron Taylor Johnson, Christopher Mintz-Plasse, Chloe Grace Moretz, Mark Strong, and Nicolas Cage. So, the story of Kick-Ass, well, it was in 2008 that the comic book Kick-Ass first hit stores. However, even by that stage, the movie was on its way. So Kick-Ass was created by Mark Miller and John Romita Jr. That first publication, Marvel's Kick-Ass, the Dave Lazowski years, that arrived in 2008 across 4 different books. And the film rights, things were moving even as the first issue was hitting comic book store shelves. And the reason for that goes back to the premiere of a film called Stardust, which I really, really love. It's Matthew Vaughn's second film as director, I think, after Layer Cake. And Matthew Vaughn and Mark Miller sort of knew each other and had hit it off. And so Miller was along at the premiere. of Stardust. And it was there that Vaughn was having a conversation, just like, well, we should work together on something. Just let us know what you've got. And so Miller pitched the idea of Kick-Ass at that point. So this was in 2007, and Vaughn's just, yeah, that sounds interesting. So off Miller went to write a synopsis. And they kept in touch. And I mean, Matthew Vaughn, off the back of Layer Cake and off Stardust as well, was reportedly in the running for a bunch of projects at this stage. I mean, it's known that he was considered for a James Bond film at one point, actually, but also the film Hancock. I remember his name being very, very briefly linked with that. He didn't get any of those jobs, as it happened, but he was interested in this superhero tale that Mark Miller had come up with. And so, I mean, what he decided in the end was, well, let's give that a go. Now, Matthew Vaughn's talked in interviews, in fact, he's talked in an interview with me at one point, about how he tends to work on one thing at a time. He's not the kind of person who has 7 or 8 projects going. He zeroes in on something of interest. And he seemed to be zeroing in on this. And so in comes Jane Goldman into the story, and Goldman and Vaughn had worked together on Stardust and had a good working process as well. So their idea, I mean, the way they go about working is they get together, they work out the structure of the story that they're looking to tell, then off they go in separate directions. Goldman goes off to, I think it used to be the shed at the bottom of her garden to write. And then emails and phone calls go backwards and forwards as they shape the script and hammer out the story that they want to tell. In the case of Kick-Ass, I mean, Mark Miller, at the point he sold the pitch and got Vaughn interested in the idea of doing a movie, didn't actually have the ending to the story. And so you had this thing where Goldman and Vaughn were mapping out one version of the story for the film, and Miller and John Romita Jr. were working on the other version to run through the comic books. And so, I mean, as Jane Goldman told me at one point, I think it was around the time of the film coming out, just said Mark was just really cool about it. He said he just wanted everyone alive at the end of the first book because he wanted to do a follow-up book. And so you were going to get slightly different variants of sort of the same story, certainly born from the same ingredients. Now, Matthew Vaughn was going to have to develop this as an independent movie. And, I mean, he produced Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. He got independent stuff through before. He'd produced Snatch as well before turning his hand to directing with Layer Cake. But with Kick-Ass, he did take this around the main studios, and I mean, almost inevitably, really, they all turned him down. And at the heart of their objections was one of the reasons why Vaughn wanted to make the film in the first place, the character of Hit Girl, this foul-mouthed pre-teen girl who, incredibly violent, spits out not particularly savoury language. And when the pitch went into studios, I mean, they either wanted the character of Hit Girl dropped altogether or made older. I mean, you could get away with her saying rude words and kicking people, although it was mainly the rude words that were the problem. If you put her in her late teens, for instance, and so Sony turned the project down. I mean, Vaughn had a relationship with them off the back of Layer Cake. And I mean, pretty much every studio turned them down. As Vaughn would explain to the Comic Book Resources website, he just said he was going to them and saying, look, this is a really good script. It's going to make a good film. But they just weren't interested. And as he reflected, I had the same experience when I was producing Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels. Everybody said no and that they weren't interested. So I said, you know what? I'm going to try it again. And try it again. He did. He just kept pushing and pushing and pushing. But in this instance, he realised that if he wanted to make effectively an R-rated comic book movie, then he was going to have to raise the money himself. He knew by doing so that the budget would be more modest than if Kick-Ass was going to be a studio film. However, Vaughn also had a few coins in his own bank account. The success of Lock, Stock and Two Smoking Barrels had certainly made him money. Snatch had certainly made him money as well. And what that bought for Matthew Vaughn was some degree of independence, certainly independence from the Hollywood studio system. This is the point that people like George Lucas got to, so he could make Star Wars The Phantom Menace without studio interference. More recently, we've seen Francis Ford Coppola make Megalopolis with his own money without studio interference. Vaughn was having to put Kick-Ass together as basically an independent movie with no distributor in place as he put it into production. It did mean that he didn't have to play by studio rules. He didn't have to hold back on violence. He didn't have to hold back on language. It was okay that 11, 12-year-old was causing all sorts of mayhem and teaching adults new words that obviously, by the response that would ultimately come out, they'd never heard before. And the film in the end would be made for a relatively modest $30 million. That, I mean, it's certainly in the scheme of superhero and comic book movies at that point, that's about a third of the price, even a fifth of the price that others seem to be paying. But it did afford him the opportunity to make the film that he really wanted to make. So they got the script to a point that they were happy with, just as Mark Miller and John Romita Jr. were getting to the point, a similar point with the comic book as well. And so they nearly scored for the movie a very early casting coup when Brad Pitt, who had appeared in the film Snatch, of course, agreed to take on effectively the cameo role of Big Daddy in the Kick-Ass movie. What a moment that was for the film. An independent landing Brad Pitt, brilliant. In fact, Daniel Craig was linked around that the same time as well. He'd, of course, worked with Vaughn on Layer Cake. However, Brad Pitt would have to drop out of the eventual movie, but not before his named involvement had given the project a bit of profile, really. Yet Pitt had a commitment to make Quentin Tarantino's film Inglourious Basterds, and so he went off to do that himself, and he had to drop out of the Kick-Ass movie. That did leave some casting holes to be filled, and I mean, let's face it, filled they absolutely were. In the end, it would be Nicolas Cage who would take on the role of Big Daddy in Kick-Ass, obviously a die-hard comic book fan, and he would bring, well, a very comic book sensitivity to his performance as well, which I'll come to shortly. But for the rest of the film's ensemble, Vaughn could pretty much pick whoever he wanted. This wasn't a case of, again, him having to cross-check casting choices with a studio executive who would go, oh, I'm not sure they're so right for the role. And so he gathered together a bunch of unknowns through an extensive audition process, and that's where you get Aaron Taylor Johnson with his big breakthrough role. Christopher Mintz-Plasse had played McLovin in Superbad, and he auditioned for the role of Kick-Ass, actually. Having read the first issue of the comic before he got the script, he would land a villainous role instead, that of Red Mist. Clark Duke, a paid-up comic book enthusiast, already a huge fan of Mark Miller's work, he landed a key role as well. And then there was Chloe Grace Moretz. Now, she got the script around a month after the movie Wanted landed in cinemas. Now, Wanted also was based on comic book work by Mark Miller, and, well, she was particularly taken with the film. That she saw the promo for it. It was just like, why can't I be in something like that? And then it was a month after that, she got the script from her agent for Kick-Ass. Now, she hadn't heard of the comic, but certainly researched it when she got the script. And she set her heart on the role of Hit Girl, which she would duly land. Like the rest of the cast as well, she had to throw herself into preparation for the shooting of the movie. In the case of Chloe Grace Moretz, she had to go off to a circus school so she could tackle the kind of stunts that the film needed. This wasn't a movie that could spend a metric ton of cash on visual effects work. There was going to be physical in-camera stuff as well. And also, I mean, Clark Duke, for instance, he gave an interview saying, well, he didn't have to do that much training because his work was dialogue-driven, and quite a lot of the characters and moments in the film are dialogue-driven, that it chooses its action sequences quite particularly. There's not a ton of them in the film, but Vaughn and his team were just going to make sure that they counted. There was the coming together then of the cast, and in particular, the young cast knew that Nicolas Cage was involved, and to some degree in awe of Nicolas Cage as well. In fact, Chloe Grace Moretz would explain to comic book resources that she did actually meet with Cage ahead of shooting. And she said, actually, after I read the script, I went in for it and I booked the role and I sat down with Matthew and we talked about the whole thing. We discussed what we wanted, what he wanted to do and what I wanted to do. And I actually had a meeting with Matthew, Nicolas Cage and my mum. We all met in this little cabin in the countryside of London. I don't know much countryside in London, but fair enough. And we just sat there and had tea, talked about the script, talked about what we wanted to do with our characters, and basically bonded. That's how the camera shoot got started between me and Nick, and she just said, he's an amazing guy. Now, just one aside, actually, I did the press junket for Kick-Ass when it was in London, and a fair play to Chloe Grace Moretz. I don't know whether this is true or not, but we were told that we had to slide slightly wait for interviews to start because she was in the posh hotel having lobster. I think she was about 12 at the time. When I was 12, I was not in a posh hotel having lobster. I think I was in a Wimpy having a milkshake. You know, contrast, swings and roundabouts, right? In September 2008, Kick-Ass began shooting. It would film in Canada and in London. And this, because of the working relationship between Matthew Vaughn and Jane Goldman, this was a case where the screenwriter was very welcome on the set of the movie. And in fact, Goldman would tell me that she was constantly tweaking the script as the film was shooting. And she's really open to this. She just says, someone says a line and you can think of a better one, you can change it right there. She said, it's great. It's just making the thing better. The comic book was slightly delayed because of the film's production, because John Romita Jr. was needed to do some illustrations and animation work for the feature itself. But then there was the moment when Nicolas Cage came in to take on the role of Big Daddy for the first time. And he started talking in an accent, in a particular way that just took the filmmakers aback at first. And what it became clear was that Cage had come on set with a view of how the role should be played. And he based his Big Daddy on the portrayal of Batman as put on screen by Adam West, not least in the 1966 movie. And it's just a piece of nerd gold that, I mean, soon the filmmakers were very, very much on board with. There was conversation throughout the shoot of the film, however, as to will a distributor actually pick this movie up? Because, I mean, it's okay putting your own money in, but Matthew Vaughn was reportedly joking that this was going to be the most expensive home movie he'd ever made. It really was a leap into the unknown to attract this amount of money, to put his own money in as well, in the hope that this really left field superhero film that they were making would land enough with an audience and in turn persuade distributors to put the film out into the world. Now, what I can't get fixed is a definitive end of filming date for Kick-Ass, but it did look like the shoot went on into 2009. I've seen dates like April and June. That strikes me as quite a long time. It's quite hard to get the definitive story on that. But it was a fairly lengthy and also physical shoot. The fact it was taking place in 2 countries as well, that would have an impact on the logistics of it. But it was in 2009 that the slow word of mouth for the movie really started to build up. Because, I mean, the interesting thing I think about the Kick-Ass film story is how fandom really took hold of the film even before it was released. And it was that opened Hollywood's eyes and traditional Hollywood studios' eyes, or more traditional ones anyway, to what this film could actually do and what segment of the audience it could actually hit. And if there was a turning point, I think it was San Diego Comic-Con in July 2009. And we were in an era already where San Diego Comic-Con was becoming quite a big deal, really. And it wasn't a bad springboard for a project. In this case, Matthew Vaughn and the team arrived en masse to screen the first footage from Kick-Ass, and it pretty much brought the house down. And it was the response to that from fans in particular that finally got distributors involved, because a month after the response at San Diego Comic-Con, Lionsgate would pick up the American rights to distribute Kick-Ass, and then also Universal were picking up the rights to distribute it elsewhere in the world, including the UK. The irony, of course, is the studios had to pay more to pick up the film to distribute it than they would have done if they'd supported it from the start. And Vaughn addressed the potential, really, schadenfreude of it in an interview with First Showing around the time of the film's release. And what Vaughn reconciled was how Mark Miller had pointed out to him that saying, you realise the people who've said no to this film are the people you're going to have to try to sell it to again when it's finished. And they'd had that conversation right at the start of the project. And Miller had said to Vaughn, what makes you think that they're going to say yes? And Vaughn said, yeah, you're right. But also at that stage, he just started shooting it. And he said, when he told me that, I had such belief in the film and I felt passionate about it. And I just thought that's what's wrong with the film industry. There's not enough people doing what they think is right and loving what they do. And Vaughn said, I love making movies. I'm the luckiest man alive to have a job which feels like a dream come true. Now, when I first became aware of Kick-Ass properly, I was aware that the film was coming and was slowly building up, but it wasn't a massive deal until relatively close to its release. But it was a colleague of mine who I was working with back in my Den of Geek days who was in a London comic book store and was approached by someone, and he was asked, would you like to go and see a preview screening, a work in progress preview screening of a new Nicolas Cage film? Well, because he's a very sensible person, this person then said, yes, I would like to go and see a preview screening of a new Nicolas Cage film. And he came back and got on the phone to me. He was absolutely raving about it. But this was the way that the word of mouth was picking up. So the springboard was San Diego Comic-Con, but all the clips that were coming out, all the news stories that were coming out were adding fuel to this, really. And then it was announced at the start of 2010 that the movie was going to premiere at the South by Southwest Festival in March of that year. That was also the same point, though, January of 2010, that a clip landed that began some of the raging attacks against the film's language. Not its violence, but the fact that the C word, and I don't mean chopsticks, was uttered by a youngster. While that controversy was bubbling, and it will continue to bubble, I'm coming back to that shortly, the film was finally seen in full. And the initial response to it from the critical fraternity was really quite positive, that some people went against it. I'm coming to one in particular shortly. But generally, the fact that it was doing something different from the assortment of superhero films that were around at the time was particularly lauded. The performances, not least Chloe Grace Moretz's, were praised. And it just felt a little bit more dangerous. Outrageous was the word that was coming up several times in reviews. The potty mouth nature of it, the violence of it, all the obvious things really were picked up in reviews, but generally the critical consensus was this is a really good and fun film, although there were some outright haters for it. It came out, its release date was staggered, that it came out in the US a couple of weeks after the UK release. The UK release went down particularly well, but let's zero in on the US box office numbers. That's generally not a bad indicator. In the US it came out the weekend of April the 16th to the 18th of 2010, and it topped the box office chart. This $30 million film was opening in first place with $19.8 million. It knocked How to Train Your Dragon off the top of the chart, and Date Night and Death at a Funeral, and the infamous Clash of the Titans. That was the top five. In fact, it was Clash of the Titans that was number one the week before. It only just got the number one slot. How to Train Your Dragon got 19.6 million, but it was a relatively competitive top five there. The 6 to 10 slots were taken by The Last Song, Why Did I Get Married To, Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland on its 7th week of release, Hot Tub Time Machine, I think Clark Duke's in that as well, was in 9th, and The Bounty Hunter with Gerard Butler was in 10th place. But comic book movies do tend to drop quite a lot of business in their second week if you're playing to a very deep genre crowd. Put the more recent Marvel stuff aside, you're looking generally at about a 60% drop, although just at the point this has been recorded, Joker Folie à Deux has dropped 81%, highest second weekend drop I can ever really remember. In the case of Kick-Ass, it dropped 52.9%. Not a bad result, really, as How to Train Your Dragon jumped to the top of the chart. The Backup Plan opened that weekend in second place. Date Night was there. Another comic book movie, The Losers, a really good one, actually. I'm quite a fan of that. Opened in fourth place. Kick-Ass more than holding its own, though, just about in the top five with another, 9.4 million. And in fact, the American release of Kick-Ass, by week 3, it was up against A Nightmare on Elm Street remake and the very, very bizarre Furry Vengeance. That's Brendan Fraser in that. Its US take for an R-rated comic book superhero movie was 48 million. And with the best will in the world, Kick-Ass is no Batman. A lot of the audience wouldn't be aware of it. And so it was introducing a new character and also with a restrictive rating as well. Outside of the US, it did roughly the same amount of money. The total worldwide box office gross of the film was just shy of $100 million, $96.1 million. And so a very profitable venture, but one that continued to reverberate, really. Because, let me bring you back to the UK, because during and in the aftermath of the film's release, Now, uncharacteristically, the British blog The Daily Mail got its knickers in a bit of a twist over it. Now, its then lead critic was a man called Christopher Tuckey, and he wrote several articles about the language and violence in the film. Now, in fairness to Christopher Tuckey, he did actually take umbrage with both the violence and the language. What was interesting about a lot of the complainants was they objected to what an 11, 12-year-old saying the C word, but they didn't mind kicking 7 shades out of an assortment of people. At least Tuckey had, Christopher Tuckey was fairly uniform in his dislike of the movie. The Daily Mail published quite a few articles against the film, and then I remember Christopher Tuckey also writing a piece about how the online mob were out to get him because he didn't like it. Now, his review is still live, and I mean, it was utter grist to the mill of the marketing effort for the film. I've talked about Ben Wheatley's film Sightseers on this podcast before, and how delighted Ben Wheatley was to get 1 star off the Daily Mail, not least because in Sightseers there is a dig at Daily Mail readers, and it's sort of like a badge of honour that you can use in the marketing if the Daily Mail hates your film on some degree of moral ground. I mean, the hypocrisy of it is out there and easy to have a conversation about, but let's just stick to the film, right? And so what Christopher Tuckey wrote, I mean, the article with the review of the film just said, "Don't be fooled by the hype. This crime against cinema is twisted, cynical, and revels in the abuse of childhood." That was the headline. The one-word summary of the film was, quote, "evil." And I mean, he wrote in his piece, the reason the movie is sick as well as thick is that it breaks one of the last cinematic taboos by making the most violent, foul-mouthed and sexually aggressive character Hit Girl an 11-year-old. I didn't find her a sexually aggressive character personally. I can't really argue with the violence and the foul-mouthed. And I mean, I do know that Christopher Tuckey took a lot of pushback for his opinion on the film. He's perfectly entitled to the film. He laid out his justification. In fact, I dug out his book, Better Criticism, 10 Commandments for a Dying Art. And I mean, it's one of the films that's discussed in there as well. But, I mean, I put this to Jane Goldman, just some of the backlash that the film had around the time of its release. And she just said, you know, everyone's entitled to their opinion. I actually question how genuinely outraged they are. I think it would be a different issue if they were genuinely outraged. A lot of it is the business of selling newspapers. I do think the concerted campaign that the Daily Mail raged against Kick-Ass in the UK certainly helped its notoriety and probably helped its box office as well. And as much as I don't particularly buy there's no such thing as bad publicity, it kind of played into the audience that Universal in the UK was ultimately trying to tap into to bring Kick-Ass in. It came out with a 15 certificate, a harder-edged superhero film, and the so-called moral guardians of the UK didn't like it. What on earth was not to like about it? And so, in the aftermath of the film's success, some ramifications to it. I mean, there were questions about, is this going to open up R-rated and 15 certificate comic book movies? And the answer was, no, it didn't really at all. Not for some time. I think the Watchmen film set those back quite a lot. It wouldn't be until Deadpool, really, which was also fueled by fan response to footage, of course, that, I mean, eyes started to open properly to the possibility here. But still, there were conversations about a sequel to Kick-Ass. And, I mean, there was a lot of umming and ahhing about it. In the aftermath of the film's release, I mean, Mark Millar was interviewed by Movie Freak and seemed quite adamant it was going to happen. He just said, I think there's no doubt about it. But he said you have to put it in perspective. It made 100 million-ish at the international box office. It's going to do really well on DVD and Blu-ray with the fans. But also, he argued, we think it's going to go much wider than that people are really going to discover it now they can watch it at home. He just said again, we think it will go crazy on DVD and Blu-ray. And he was not wrong. And he says, I think if this first one continues to do well, then a second one will be created. I know I want to do it, and I know Matthew wants to do it. So and so hopefully we'll get the chance to make the sequel. And yeah, it was one of the road to Kick-Ass 2 was a much longer one than most of us were expecting. That as Matthew Vaughn went off to do X-Men First Class, which he turned around in about 13 months or something like that. I mean, the questions even then at the junket for that is, are you doing Kick-Ass 2? What's happening with Kick-Ass 2? Is that going to be yours? Now, Kick-Ass 2 would come along 3 years later, actually, in the end, 2013, and a completely different director and writer came aboard, a previous guest that I've had on the Film Stories podcast, Jeff Wadlow. He would write and direct the movie, based again on the writing of Mark Miller and John Romita Jr., and it would bring the cast back along with Jim Carrey. I'm going to come to the story in more depth in a future piece on the film. But Kick-Ass 2 just, I mean, it kind of fizzled out, really. It never had the impact of the original. It cost roughly the same amount of money to make, but its box office was down 30-40% on the first film, and it didn't have the same pickup on DVD and Blu-ray, not least because the DVD and Blu-ray market was in some degree of decline at that point. Kick-Ass 2 then was looking like it was going to be the end of the story, that there was, as they went into production on that, talk of a Kick-Ass 3. And it's only now that we move forward to, I'm in 2024 now, and Matthew Vaughn got the Kick-Ass rights back in 2023. And as a result of that, at the point this has been recorded, there are finally more films going forward. That the third film is going to be Stunt Nuts Does School Fight. Damien Walters is directing that. He's also written the script for it as well. And I mean, principal photography on it wrapped up in, I think it was the summer of 2021, so some 3 years ago. At the point this has been recorded, but the idea is it's the springboard to a new trilogy of Kick-Ass films. Will it take off? Will it work? It's a good question, and I've done that thing of asking a question that I answer myself, so obviously I find myself 2 points and a cup of coffee there. But there is a feeling that 2010's Kick-Ass was a degree of lightning in a bottle. That kind, it's a good cliche, that I'm going to stick to it. And something of a one-off that couldn't quite be recaptured. We'll find out if that's true going forward. But there was a moment, I mean, back in 2008, really, where Matthew Vaughn, Mark Miller, and the team involved were just in a position where the film was at an attainable price they could just about cover, and they could take a gamble and do it independently. If they did it now, it probably cost 3 times as much money. A studio would be involved and probably come out the other end less impressive as well. The fact is, they did it their way. They did it on their terms. They did it to their budget. And Kick-Ass turned out to be a hell of a hit.
Support comes from ServiceNow. We're for people doing the fulfilling work they actually want to do. That's why this ad was written and read by a real person and not AI. You know what people don't want to do? Boring, busy work. Now with AI agents built into the ServiceNow platform, you can automate millions of repetitive tasks in every corner of your business, IT, HR, and more, so your people can focus on the work that they want to do. That's putting AI agents to work for people. It's your turn. Visit servicenow.com.
And that brings me to the halfway point of this episode of Film Stories. Thank you so much for listening, and thank you for your time. We're in the parish notice section now. And so, first of all, if you like this podcast, it is an independent podcast. I am not backed by major broadcasting conglomerates or huge companies with mass marketing budgets. The reason I'm, 6 years into this and still going is because of people like you. And there's a couple of things you can do just to help this podcast get noticed. Thank you for any of these. I mean, just listening to it, I'm really appreciative for. If you really like it, if you go to patreon.com/Simon Brew and put some money in the pot there, you get the podcast early and ad-free pretty much every week. You also find out the gossip of what I'm up to behind the scenes with the entire Film Stories project as well. And it just helps with the whole running of independent publishing, which is a bit of a bit difficult. Let's just put it that way. Costing you nothing, though, is to subscribe at your podcast home of choice. Just click the subscribe button. Massively helps. Likewise, if you can leave ideally a hugely positive review, that is much appreciated as well. Thank you to everybody who's done that. I'm also a print magazine nerd as well as absolutely adoring films. I've combined these two interests to create 2 different print magazines. Film Stories magazine is the UK's biggest. It is 168 pages every issue. It's on really nice paper as well. And the latest issue of it is just about to go on sale. You can find it at store.filmstories.co.uk. It costs a fortune to put print magazines in newsagents, so apologies, most of it's via mail order. It's not quite the way I'd do it ideally, but here we are. I also do Film Junior magazine. Now, this is a magazine for film fans aged under 14. 7 to 14, somewhere around that. They also write chunks of it as well. They get paid for writing. It's the kind of magazine I wished it existed when I was a kid. It does exist now. And again, if you go to store.filmstories.co.uk, you can pick up a copy of it there. But that is enough parish notices. I'm now going to move on to the second of the two films I'm going to talk about in this episode. This is a slightly more taxing production, as you're about to find out. We're going to the back end of the 90s. I'll start with a clip from the trailer, come to the story, the other side of this.
Not many men know what their life's worth. I do. 70 grand. That's what they took from me. That's what I was gonna get back. They weren't wearing their seatbelts.
Who the hell are you?
I'm Porter.
He said his name was Porter.
Porter? Porter?
Yeah, real Cro-Magnon looking. You're not gonna kill me, are you?
Well, what's his first name?
I don't know.
You.
No, don't allow me.
You look pretty good for a dead guy.
You were the only good thing in my life that hadn't been taken from me. I couldn't stay away.
You're one hell of a mosquito.
To get rid of you, I'll swat you with 130 grand.
It's not 100.
Hey!
Perfect.
Yes, it's all right. He's just killing my alligator bags and shooting holes in my suit. Man, that's just mean.
It is mean, I agree. That is a clip from 1999's Payback. Screenplay credited to Brian Helgeland, directed by Brian Helgeland as well, based on Richard Stark's The Hunter, and starring Mel Gibson, Greg Henry, Maria Bello, David Paymer, a bunch of other people, one or two of whom we're going to come to shortly. So, the story of Payback. I mean, let's go back to Donald E. Westlake's book, The Hunter, which he wrote under the name of Richard Stark. Now, The Hunter has been adapted several times. It turned into John Borman's 1967 film, Point Blank, starring Lee Marvin. It's also, I mean, the lead character Parker in it has turned up. I mean, Jason Statham played him in Parker in 2013. Robert Duvall played Parker in 1973's The Outfit as well. But for the purposes of this story, we're going to go to Brian Helgeland. Now, Helgeland, as we find him in, about 1996, early 97, when this story starts, a screenwriter primarily known for that. His credits were, he was the writer of Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master, 976 Evil, Highway to Hell. But then, 1997 was a bit of a banner year that he won. He won the Golden Raspberry Award. I'm not a fan of those, but I note it for 1997's The Postman. The same year, he won the Academy Award for 1997's LA Confidential. Both of those were awarded in 1998, of course. But also, he was working on the film Conspiracy Theory. Now, this was a film that he wrote, that Richard Donner directed, that Mel Gibson, Julia Roberts and Patrick Stewart starred in. And it was during post-production on Conspiracy Theory that the road to what would become Payback would be paved. Because, by this point, LA Confidential was heading towards release as well. But Helgeland had been noodling with an adaptation of The Hunter and had 30 pages of a screenplay together. Now, Richard Donner had been a mentor of sorts of Brian Helgeland, and it was, again, during that post-production that he was in Richard Donner's office on the Warner Brothers lot, went over to where the film was being put together, saw Mel Gibson. He was holding this script, and Gibson asked him about it. Showed it, just like, yeah, I quite like the look of that. Helgeland was fairly insistent that at this point that he wanted to direct it himself. Gibson told him to go away, work it up, and if he could come up with something that worked, then yeah, he'd like to be in that. Now, Gibson at this stage was at the height of his powers, a far more contentious figure here in 2024 than he was in 1996, 1997. Braveheart had come out in 95, won him Oscars in 96, had put a fair amount of coinage into the vaults of his Icon Productions company, and he was quite taken with the screenplay, well, certainly the segment of the screenplay that he read, and also, crucially, he was willing to make a fast decision on the film. And it got to a point where he put it to Helgeland that if he could get the movie up and running in 12 weeks, Gibson could just about slot in taking on the lead role before he was needed elsewhere. And so all of a sudden, a first-time director had one of the world's biggest movie stars in his film, saying yes, ready to go. So Helgeland, outside of Gibson, did have little bits of trouble with other parts of the casting for the film. That, I mean, as much as some of the roles came together, for instance, people like Deborah Kara Unger, James Coburn, John Glover, William Devane, one of the tricky roles actually to cast was one of the female leads, the character Rosie. And the auditions for this role were not going well at all. An assortment of actors came in and auditioned for the role, but Helgeland didn't see what he was after. So what he decided to do was head into the Warner Brothers archives a little bit and to go through a mix of tapes for other movies that people were auditioning for. And it was while looking through tapes for an abandoned Superman project that Warner Brothers was working on that he found Maria Bello's audition. And so he got in touch with her. That's how she came to be in the movie. The role of Val Resnick, meanwhile, attracted actors such as Ted Danson and Albert Brooks. They came in to audition, but it was Greg Henry in the end who would land that particular part. And then ahead of filming, I mean, this so far has been a relatively brief film story. I mean, Brian Helgeland threw himself into preparation for the movie. He didn't have long to get it up and running, and so he decided to storyboard the entire feature before he was on set. And then by this stage, studio backers were in. Paramount and Warner Brothers were going to split the distribution of the movie. Here in the UK, we got it through Warner Brothers. Paramount took the North American and the Japanese rights as well. The budget was going to come in around 90 million by the end. A good chunk of that would be Mel Gibson's fee. And so, I mean, Warner Brothers quite happy to continue any relationship with him at that stage, not least because it had a new Lethal Weapon film gestating, which I'll come to shortly. And so, I mean, Helgeland did have a moment early on where he was talking about wanting to shoot it in black and white, but the studios were resistant to it. And, I mean, long story short, in September 1997, the film was shooting less than a year after it had originally been pitched to Mel Gibson. So Helgeland took all of those storyboards and then decided not to use them when it came to the shoot of the movie, but also he was taking influence from a bunch of films he really liked. Films such as Dirty Harry and The Getaway were heavily informing the visual style he wanted for the film. The locations were Chicago and Los Angeles. I mean, this was a very American film. And I mean, it was chugging along. This wasn't an action-heavy movie, but it was a fairly intense one to make by the sounds of it, because as they were heading towards the end of production, Mel Gibson and Brian Helgeland seemed to have slightly different approaches to which way the film should go. Now, there was also one incident during the making of the movie where Deborah Unger would basically crack two of her ribs. That's something that makes it into one of the cuts of the film. But when it wrapped up shooting in November of 1997, I mean, there wasn't really a hint at the drama that was going to follow in post-production. But drama there was, and in no short supply as well. Because, I mean, first of all, let's just deal with the colour of the movie. That even though it wasn't shot in black and white, the film stock did go through a bleach bypass process in post-production to take the colour tones down. And then there was a promo trailer that was assembled, which brought together quite a lot of the film's lighter moments as well. And so there's an inherent darkness to the film Payback, but the initial stuff that was being cut together by studio marketing had it more as a bit more of a knockabout Mel Gibson action comedy. I mean, why wouldn't you posit it like that? Sold Lethal Weapon films perfectly well, so perhaps that was the thinking. But Helgeland objected to that promotion, but it wasn't a fight that he won. However, one thing that he did win on March the 23rd, 1998, was an Academy Award. He won his Oscar for Best Adapted Screenplay for LA Confidential, film distributed by Warner Brothers. Within, I think it was 2 to 3 days of collecting his Oscar, he'd been fired from Payback. And the reason for that was the continual creative clashes that were going on behind the scenes. Because by this stage, there was a very severe difference of opinion between Mel Gibson and Brian Helgeland as to the direction of the movie. The best will in the world, the studios were only going to go one way there. And while he thought, he knew it was coming, he sensed it was coming. And while he thought for a moment that if he won the Oscar, that might just save his job, long story short, again, it did not save his job. And what happened was a new director was brought in, and there was some confusion as to who that director was. But Paul Absacoll on his website has claimed that he came in to finish the directing of Payback. Helgeland takes credit. I'll come to that shortly. Now, Paul Absacoll had directed a fair amount of TV at this point, and also he'd done some behind-the-scenes stuff on Lethal Weapon 3. There had been some chatter that the replacement director being brought in was John Myra, but I think over time it does look like it was Paul Absacoll who landed it. But the amount of retooling that was about to required really meant that a new screenwriter needed to come in. Now, that clearly wasn't going to be Brian Helgeland. He'd just been fired from the film. And so the person who got the nod was Terry Hayes. Now, Terry Hayes came in, and in more recent times, he's been writing novels. He's done the I Am Pilgrim and the Year of the Locust novel. He's written the tie-in novel for Argylle as well. Terry Hayes at this point had worked with George Miller on Mad Max 2, Mad Max Beyond Thunderdome, a bunch of films, and he was brought in to do rewrite work on Payback while the film was in post-production. And so it was quite a lot of work that needed doing as well. The estimates were that some 30% of the movie needed to be redone as a result of the decision to basically rip up the last third of the movie, certainly the last act of it. And, according to a Sun Sentinel report ahead of the film's release as well, Mel Gibson was quite defensive about his position in all of this because he was the star and he was the power, and none of this would have happened without his sign-off. And so going to that newspaper report, it does say Gibson was central in taking the film away from first-time director Brian Helgeland, the screenwriter of The Great LA Confidential and The Awful The Postman. I quite like The Postman. Unhappy with his first cut, the Sentinel wrote, Gibson hired another writer and an anonymous director. This was interesting. The name of the director just didn't come out at the time, to redo a reported 30%, told you, or so of the movie. Now, Gibson defended his position. He said, I can understand why it seems like a juicy piece of gossip. There was erroneous reportage that Brian got fired and all this kind of stuff, which is completely not the case. It sort of was the case, though, as history seems to have told. He was not fired, Gibson insists. There were changes required from the studio and from the producers, and I'm one of the producers. It's my production company. Helgeland didn't make the changes and was thus ultimately removed from the project. And as Gibson argued, of course, you're always trying to make something better. We engaged Brian and asked him if he would think about some changes and some reshoots. He opted not to do those because he felt it was compromising his artistic integrity, which is fine. He can't go there if he really believes that, and he did. And thus, he was removed from the film. But again, to quote Gibson in this, he was not fired. Not quite sure what he was, but he wasn't on the film against his will. So, let's work it out. Gibson could have held out for him, but Gibson wanted the change. The studios wanted the change as well. And that final act that we see in the longer, ironically enough, theatrical cut of the film was as a result of these changes. The reason we get Chris Christopherson, who's just passed just a few weeks before recording this, in the movie at all was part of those rewrites. He was brought in to play the film's main villain, introduced really late in the day. The problem, though, was all of this was causing a further delay to the release of the movie. This had been quite a lean production, in theory, that could be turned around relatively quickly, but now Gibson was shooting Lethal Weapon 4. Now, Lethal Weapon 4 came together very, very quickly to fill a gap in Warner Brothers' summer 1998 schedule. It didn't even start shooting until January of that year and had to be in cinemas by the summer. So, fairly frantic times all round, and that's where Gibson's attention needed to be. And it was only after he'd done on Lethal Weapon 4 and it was out in the world that he could go back to Payback to reshoot sequences for the movie and basically to put this new ending together. I mean, it put it all back by the best part of a year. It took that long for them to come back together. And then it was 10 days of reshoots that were ordered to get the film into the shape that Gibson and the studio were happy with. So, I mean, in an interview with Chud, and let's go back to Brian Helgeland, because he then had the option as a first-time director of basically withdrawing his name from it. And he admitted he did consider it, that he considered taking the infamous moniker Alan Smithy as his director credit. Now, Alan Smithy is a story well known, but basically for a long time, if you were a director who wanted to take your name off a film, you could take the credit Alan Smithy instead, until everyone worked out that Alan Smithy was just a fake name used by directors who didn't want to be associated with a movie anymore. Now, the Directors Guild were really reluctant to use Alan Smithy. And also, the Guild ultimately had approval about whether Brian Helgeland was allowed to take his name off it and put this fake name on. And so he described to Chud how I had to meet with a panel over there, and they very sensibly explained to me that if on my very first directing job I was Alan Smithy, my chances of having a second directing job were going to be difficult. So I kept my name on it, apparently having done more footage than some directors who happily keep their name on a film. And I just thought it was kind of cutting off my nose to spite my face. And so Helgeland let it go out with his name. Obviously, he wasn't heavily involved in the promotion for the movie, but it was released with his name on it, and it landed in American cinemas on February the 9th, 1999. Now, that's not a peak release point in the 1990s. I talked several times in the past about now, if a film comes out in February, it can be a huge blockbuster. It wasn't really considered a blockbuster slot at that point. But this was, again, a slightly harder-edged R-rated Mel Gibson film. They were in increasingly short supply as we got to the back end of the 1990s. And so it went into American cinemas, and as you would expect with a movie star's name above the title, certainly a big movie star, it went to number one, and it went to very number one as well, 21.2 million on its opening weekend, knocking She's All That, the film in second place, down with 11 million. So number one by a good $10 million. The other films around at that point, Patch Adams, starring Robin Williams, Varsity Blues, Saving Private Ryan had been in cinemas for 29 weeks at that point. Shakespeare in Love was in there after 9 weeks. A Civil Action with John Travolta. Stepmom, Simply Irresistible was the other opener that weekend, down in 9th. And You've Got Mail was hanging around the charts in 10th. By the following week, the Kevin Costner headline Message in a Bottle had come along to take the top slot. My Favourite Martian was around as well. And, I mean, Payback was still doing reasonable business. On its third week of release, it reclaimed the top spot with 10.2 million, knocking Message in a Bottle down to second. Other films around that week, two really interesting openers, actually, February the 19th to 21st in the US. Joe Johnston's October Sky, I think it's a lovely film. And then down in 8th place is Mike Judge's Office Space, a box office failure on release, but now very much lauded, and rightly so. Payback stayed in second place for its fourth week of release as Joel Schumacher's 8mm, starring Nicolas Cage, opened, and it was only after a couple of weeks as some of the higher profile releases trundled along, Analyze This, Cruel Intentions, that Payback started to drop. But the reviews for it for the theatrical release of the film anyway had been pretty good. I mean, they'd not been utter raves or anything like that, but pretty good. And the box office returns from the theatrical cut of the movie, which came in at 101 minutes, worldwide, it was 161 million. The film took in the US alone, it took 81 million. And so this was a solid domestic and international hit. However, the story of Payback wasn't done because, over time, there was conversations about the version of the film that we hadn't seen. And basically, Brian Helgeland's cut of the movie. And so this was when the DVD market was really starting to boom. And those of you who were buying films in the early 2000s will remember that studios needed very little excuse to put a movie out again and again and again and again with Super Edition, Extended Edition, Lovely Edition, Farming Edition, all sorts of stuff. In the case of Payback, Brian Helgeland was interested in going back to to his film about and really just doing something else with it. So in the aftermath of its release, I mean, let's just tie this up. I mean, he did direct again. He went on to do A Knight's Tale in 2001, starring Heath Ledger, a good solid hit as well. In 2003, he reunited with Heath Ledger for The Order, which I think became known as The Sin Eater by the time it came to us. That was a film that was messed around with a fair amount. In more recent times, he's directed things like 42 and Legend. But, I mean, as we go to heading towards the mid-2000s, I mean, it was kind of, I mean, he would reflect, really, it was a kind of time heals all wounds kind of thing. That in an interview that took place a few years later, I mean, he did reflect on the whole thing. He just said it wasn't good. He said, I was going to get fired, told you, because I refused to do the reshoots. And my attitude was that if my father told me to do something, I wouldn't do it. So why should I do it for Paramount? And he talked about how he was nominated for an Oscar at that point. He won the Oscar, and then 2 days later, he was fired after he'd won Oscar Gold. But he had kept hold of a bootleg VHS cut of his take on Payback. And he told Chud.com that eventually all the people at Paramount left, and to the point where most of them were even out of the movie business. And so the only two creators really that were heavily involved with Payback who were still left standing were Brian Helgeland and Mel Gibson. And as Helgeland said, what I ended up doing was emailing him saying I wanted to put out my version of the movie, but I needed his okay to do it. 15 minutes after emailing him, I got an email back saying he thought it was a good idea and how could he help. And so Gibson put in a call to Paramount the next day, asked them to make the resources available to Helgeland to put this alternate version out. And Helgeland said, I never discussed it with him, but judging by his actions, I think he felt bad about how it all turned out. He stood by his decision, but he felt bad about the acrimony and how it turned out. So this was his way of trying to make up for that. Still, a lot of work needed to be done because the original film footage that Helgeland had shot hadn't actually been preserved. Quite a lot of it had disappeared. And so, along with editor Kevin Stitt, they had to work with the surviving footage and reassemble a cut of the film the long way around. They slightly changed the colour presentation of it as well. And in 2006, at the Austin Film Festival, the Payback Straight Up the Director's Cut debuted for the first time. This was 90 minutes, 11 minutes shorter than the theatrical version of the movie. And the response to it was really strong as well. There's still a feeling that Helgeland's version of it was and is the better film. And by 2007, Paramount, which had pushed against him so much during the making of the movie and the post-production of it, had put the new version out on DVD as well and brought in another chunk of cash. It was a long, painful process, the road to getting his cut of the movie out, but some vindication there for Helgeland, that the feeling being that of the two versions, neither of them are bad. I think the theatrical cut of Payback is pretty good, actually. But the darker, leaner version that Helgeland put together is, of this particular production, perhaps the definitive one. That Scott Stambler had to come in and do music afresh for the director's cut of it. Chris Boardman had scored the original. It was a hell of an effort to get it together, but in the end, it was pretty much worth it. And that brings me to the end of this latest episode of Film Stories. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I mean, if I've not bored you completely, you can get more from me on Twitter and Blue Sky at Simon Brew, more from the entire Film Stories project on those platforms at Film Stories. We're at facebook.com/filmstoriesonline, youtube.com/Film Stories. You can find our store, as I mentioned before, at store.filmstories.co.uk. That's where you'll find our print magazines for sale, as well as our UK exclusive Blu-rays of Bull Durham and No Way Out, a pair of movies that we've put together special extras for as well. And if you go to filmstories.co.uk, that is our clickbait-free entertainment website. Imagine such a thing. It's very hard work to do, but I just think there's got to be a way to doing an entertainment website that's not all about clickbait and everything you need to know about articles and nonsense like that. We just try and do it a slightly more old-fashioned way. Thank you to everyone who supports us. I think that's it, though. As always, thank you so much for listening and thank you for your time. I'll be back soon with another bunch of film stories. Until then, take care, folks. Thank you again. Bye-bye.